The model of mysticism, the structural map of inner transformation. Mysticism is often treated as something vague, private, religious, irrational, or impossible to explain. It is associated with visions, ecstatic states, miracles, revelation, union with God, enlightenment, emptiness, silence, or the collapse of the ordinary self. But the Philosophical Intelligence Institute approaches mysticism differently. The model of mysticism does not ask whether one tradition is correct and another is wrong. It does not attempt to prove or disprove religious claims. It does not reduce mystical experience to psychology, nor does it turn mysticism into theology. Instead, it asks a structural question. What changes in human consciousness when mystical transformation occurs? What changes in attention? What changes in identity? What changes in emotion? What changes in cognition? What changes in the body? What changes in symbolic interpretation? And what changes in the way a person knows? This is the central purpose of the model of mysticism, to make mystical cognition intelligible without destroying its depth. The model begins from a simple observation. Across history, very different traditions describe experiences that are not identical, but structurally similar. Christian mystics speak of divine union, the dark night, the cloud of unknowing, and the transformation of the soul. Sufi mystics speak of remembrance, annihilation of the ego, subsistence in God, and the beloved. Advaita Vedānta speaks of the recognition that the deepest self is not separate from ultimate reality. Zen Buddhism points toward emptiness, no self, direct seeing, and non-dual immediacy. Taoism speaks of naturalness, non-forcing emptiness, and return to the Tao. Neoplatonism speaks of ascent, purification, and union with the One. These traditions do not say the same thing. Their metaphysics differ, their symbols differ, their practices differ, their authorities differ. But beneath those differences, something repeats. There is a movement from ordinary consciousness into deeper awareness. There is a loosening of the rigid self. There is a quieting of conceptual thought. There is a transformation of emotional life. There is a new relationship to symbols, language, and silence. There is an ethical consequence, and there is often a culminating shift in which awareness becomes immediate, spacious, transparent, or non-dual. The model of mysticism is designed to explain this repeating architecture. It is not a belief system. It is a map.
What mysticism is not. The first task is to remove confusion. Mysticism is not simply having unusual experiences. It is not the same as visions, trance, psychic claims, emotional intensity, or supernatural belief. Those phenomena may appear in some traditions or individual lives, but they are not the structural core. In the model of mysticism, mysticism is defined as a transformation in the structure of consciousness. That transformation involves the movement from constriction to transparency. Constriction means that awareness is bound by identification, fear, rigid concept, emotional defensiveness, symbolic literalism, and bodily contraction. Transparency means that these structures become less fixed. Attention becomes steadier. Identity becomes less rigid. Emotion becomes more open. Thought becomes quieter. The body becomes less defended. Symbols become more flexible. Knowledge becomes less mediated by concepts and more direct. This does not mean that the person disappears. It means that the ordinary structures of selfhood become more visible, more flexible, and less absolute. Mysticism, in this model, is not escape from life. It is a transformation of how life is experienced. The three layers of the model. The model of mysticism has three major layers. The first layer is phenomenological. This means it describes lived experience. It asks, what is actually happening in awareness? What does the person experience? What changes in perception, attention, emotion, selfhood, time, embodiment, and meaning? The second layer is semiotic. This means it studies signs, symbols, metaphors, doctrines, images, rituals, and language. Mystical experience is never interpreted in a vacuum. A Christian mystic, a Sufi mystic, and a Zen practitioner may undergo structurally similar transformations, but they interpret those transformations through different symbolic grammars. The third layer is comparative. This means the model compares traditions without reducing them. It does not claim that all traditions are identical. It asks whether different traditions perform similar functions through different languages. This is why the model studies 6 traditions across 7 analytic functions: Christian mysticism, Sufism, Advaita Vedānta, Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Neoplatonism, and the 7 functions of ontological source, epistemic pathway, symbolic mediation, experiential mode, ethical function, linguistic form, and ultimate union or liberation. The result is a structured comparison. Not all mysticism is the same, but rather, different traditions may preserve different symbolic languages for structurally comparable transformations of consciousness. The 7 core functions. At the center of the model of mysticism are 7 core functions. These are not stages in a strict order. They are interacting dimensions of consciousness. The first is attention. Mystical transformation begins when attention changes. Ordinary attention is fragmented, reactive, pulled outward by tasks, thoughts, fears, and desires. Mystical practice stabilizes attention. Attention becomes steady, spacious, and eventually reflexive. Awareness begins to notice itself. The second function is identity. Ordinary identity is usually narrative-based. It is constructed from memory, role, fear, preference, and social position. Mystical transformation loosens this identity. The self is no longer experienced as a fixed center. It becomes more transparent, more fluid, and less defended. The third function is emotion. Mystical transformation is not cold or abstract emotion. Changes deeply. Defensiveness softens fear, loosens compassion, becomes possible. Tenderness emerges. The person becomes less controlled by emotional contraction. The fourth function is cognition. The conceptual mind becomes less dominant. This does not mean intelligence disappears. Rather, thought becomes quieter, less compulsive, and less absolute. Concepts become tools, not prisons. The fifth function is embodiment. Mysticism is often imagined as disembodied, but the model argues the opposite. The body is central. Breath, posture, tension, release, stillness, and somatic openness all matter. Stable mystical development requires embodiment. The sixth function is semiotic interpretation. This is the person's relationship to symbols, language, doctrines, metaphors, and rituals. In early stages, symbols may be taken literally later. They become flexible in mature stages. They become transparent, not discarded, but understood as pointers. The seventh function is epistemic orientation. This means the way a person knows ordinary knowledge is often conceptual, inferential, or sensory. Mystical knowing becomes more direct, reflexive, and immediate. The model describes this as a shift from conceptual knowing toward direct awareness.
Together, these seven functions describe the architecture of mystical transformation. Attention stabilizes, identity loosens, emotion opens, cognition quiets, embodiment unwinds, symbols become transparent, and knowing becomes direct. The model also describes four broad developmental phases. The first phase is separation and differentiation. Here the seeker begins from ordinary fragmentation. There may be longing, dissatisfaction, spiritual aspiration, moral tension, or the sense that ordinary identity is insufficient. The person begins to notice the limits of their own mind. The second phase is illumination and transformation. Here, openings occur, attention deepens. The mind becomes quiet, emotional life softens, the body relaxes. There may be moments of unity, silence, insight, or profound presence. But these states are usually unstable. The person may move between clarity and contraction. The third phase is unity and transparency. Here the subject-object structure begins to weaken. Awareness no longer feels fully separate from experience identity, becomes transparent. Symbols lose their rigidity. Experience becomes self-revealing. This is where traditions speak of union, emptiness, non-duality, or the return to the source. The fourth phase is embodied integration. This is crucial. Mystical insight is not complete because one has had a powerful experience. The insight must become embodied in ordinary life. It must change conduct, relationships, speech, ethics, emotional maturity, humility, and action. The model of mysticism therefore rejects the idea that mysticism is merely a peak experience. A peak experience may be temporary. Mystical transformation must become integrated. 5. The recognition event. At the center of the model is what the monograph calls the recognition event. This is the pivotal moment when awareness recognizes its own nature. It is not merely thinking about awareness. It is not a belief. It is not a doctrine. It is a shift in the structure of experience. The ordinary sense of being a separate observer begins to collapse. Awareness recognizes itself not as one object among others, but as the field in which experience appears. This event may be interpreted differently across traditions. A Christian mystic may interpret it as divine intimacy. A Sufi may interpret it as annihilation in the real. An Advaita practitioner may interpret it as recognition of the self. A Zen practitioner may describe it as direct seeing. A Taoist may describe it as effortless accord with the Tao. A Neoplatonist may interpret it as return to the One. The interpretations differ, but structurally the recognition of involves a similar transformation. Identity becomes transparent, thought quiets, emotional contraction softens, symbolic systems loosen, and awareness becomes directly present to itself. The model places this recognition event at the center, not simply at the end. It is the actual insight around which the rest of the transformation becomes intelligible. The orbiting realization states. After recognition, mystical development does not simply end. The model describes two important orbiting realization states: transcendence of the I and self-luminous consciousness.
Transcendence of the I means the ordinary ego center loses its absolute authority. The person may still function normally, speak, work, choose, remember, and relate. But the inner center of gravity has shifted. The self is no longer experienced as a hard, separate, defended object. Self-luminous consciousness means awareness becomes self-revealing. It does not need to be confirmed from the outside. It is experienced as clear, present, and intrinsically intelligible. These states orbit the central recognition because they are not always stable. A person may move in and out of them. Development is recursive. There are openings, contractions, clarifications, regressions, and deeper integrations. This is why the model uses a spiral rather than a straight line. Mysticism is not a ladder climbed once. It is a repeated deepening.
The semiotic metabolism of mysticism is its account of semiotics. Mystical traditions use symbols. They use names of God, sacred images, metaphors, rituals, scriptures, chants, diagrams, koans, paradoxes, silence, poetry, and philosophical language. But symbols do not merely decorate mystical experience. They shape it. They guide attention. They organize emotion. They provide interpretive stability. They prevent confusion. They help communities transmit subtle forms of knowledge. Yet the model also shows that symbols undergo transformation. At first, symbols may be dense, rich with doctrine, imagery, mythology, and emotional charge. Then they become compressed. A prayer, a phrase, a gesture, a mantra, a koan, a single image. Finally, they may become transparent. The symbol no longer traps the mind, but opens it. This is the semiotic metabolism of mysticism. Symbolic density becomes symbolic compression. Symbolic compression becomes experiential simplicity. The sign points toward experience. Experience gives the sign substance. Then transcendence exceeds the sign. This is the sign substance, transcendence cycle. Sign as representation, substance as embodied experience, and transcendence as the collapse of symbolic mediation into direct awareness. 8. Comparative integration across traditions. The model then applies this architecture comparatively. It asks, how do traditions differ, and where do they converge? Christian mysticism often uses relational, devotional, sacramental, and apophatic language. Sufism often uses love, poetry, remembrance, annihilation, and imaginal symbolism. Advaita Vedānta uses discrimination, negation, and non-dual recognition. Zen uses directness, paradox, silence, and the deconstruction of conceptual grasping. Taoism uses natural imagery, non-forcing emptiness and harmony. Neoplatonism uses metaphysical ascent, emanation, purification, and return. These are not interchangeable, but they can be compared functionally. Each tradition has an ultimate referent. Each has a pathway of knowing. Each uses symbolic mediation. Each describes an experiential transformation. Each links insight to ethics. Each develops a linguistic strategy for the ineffable. Each names some form of union, liberation, awakening, return, or realization. This is the model's universal syntax of transcendence. ontology pathway, symbol, experience, ethics, language, union. The point is not that all traditions secretly teach the same doctrine. The point is that traditions may perform comparable structural functions while preserving irreducible symbolic and metaphysical differences. That is the PI contribution, comparison without flattening. Ethics as verification. The model gives ethics a central role. Mystical experience is not validated merely because it feels profound. The test is transformation. Does self-centeredness decrease? Does compassion deepen? Does humility increase? Does emotional defensiveness soften? Does conduct become more coherent? Does the person become less reactive, less possessive, less rigid, and more truthful? In the model of mysticism, ethics is not an external rule added after the experience. Ethics is a structural outcome of genuine transformation. Christianity may call this love. Sufism may call it adab, service or humility. Buddhism may call it compassion and non-harm. Taoism may call it non-contention and harmony. Neoplatonism may call it virtue and purification. The words differ, but the structure is clear. Mystical insight must transform life. Without ethical integration, the insight has not stabilized. Why the model matters now. The model of mysticism matters because modern culture often lacks a precise language for inner transformation. Psychology can describe health and pathology. Religion can describe doctrine and practice. Neuroscience can describe correlates of attention, emotion, and cognition. But mystical experience often falls between these domains. It is too structured to be dismissed as irrational, too transformative to be reduced to belief, too experiential to be captured by doctrine alone, too subtle to be handled by ordinary psychological categories. The model of mysticism provides a disciplined vocabulary. It allows scholars to compare traditions without reducing them. It allows practitioners to understand transformation without becoming trapped in symbolic literalism. It allows clinicians to distinguish mystical maturation from dysregulation. It allows philosophers to treat mysticism as a mode of knowing. And it allows PIA to place inner life within a broader architecture of meaning, interpretation, and human development.
The final insight, the deepest claim of the model of mysticism is not that all religions are the same. They are not. It is not that all mystical experiences are identical. They are not. It is not that doctrine is irrelevant. It is not. The claim is more precise. Mystical transformation has structure. It changes attention. It changes identity. It changes emotion. It changes cognition. It changes embodiment. It changes symbols. It changes knowing. And across cultures, these changes appear in recognizable patterns. Mysticism is therefore not merely private feeling. It is not mere belief. It is not mere poetry. It is a structured transformation of consciousness. The model of mysticism gives us a way to speak about that transformation without violating its depth. It protects mystery from reduction, but it also protects intelligence from vagueness. It allows us to say, there is an inner architecture. There are stages, functions, symbols, thresholds, and integrations. There is a movement from constriction to transparency. There is a recognition event. There is a return to embodiment. There is ethical verification. And there is a way to compare traditions without erasing them. That is the purpose of the model of mysticism, not to explain mystery away, but to make the structure of inner transformation visible.
The model of mysticism does not turn mystery into doctrine. It turns inner transformation into intelligible structure. Philosophical Intelligence Institute. Frameworks turn complexity into admissible decisions.